You probably touch glass today without even thinking about it. Maybe you looked through a window this morning, checked your phone, picked up a drinking glass, looked into a mirror. Glass is so ordinary now that your brain barely registers it. But somewhere thousands of years ago, a human being looked at a strange, shiny, transparent material and had absolutely no idea what it was. No chemistry textbook, no laboratory, no thermometer, no factory, just fire, rocks, sand, and a very strange accident. And somehow, humans figured out how to make it again. So how did humans invent glass? And more importantly, how did they even realize that ordinary sand could become something completely different? Let's go back to the beginning, because the first glassmaker probably wasn't trying to invent glass at all. Imagine you're living thousands of years ago. There are no glass windows, no bottles, no microscopes, no screens. If you want to see something, you look at it directly. If you want a container, you make one from clay, wood, stone, or animal skin. And if you need something transparent, well, you probably don't even have the concept, because transparent materials are extremely unusual in nature. You have water, you have ice, maybe crystals, but none of them behave quite like glass. And this is where things get interesting, because glass doesn't begin as something that looks like glass. It begins as ordinary minerals, the same kind of stuff humans were walking over every day. Sand, stone, ash, things that look completely boring until you add enough heat. Here's the part nobody tells you about ancient inventions. Humans didn't need to understand why something worked before they could learn that it worked. You don't need to understand combustion chemistry to discover that fire cooks food. You don't need to understand metallurgy to notice that certain rocks produce useful metal. And you don't need to understand molecular structures to notice that something strange happens when certain minerals get extremely hot. Ancient people were essentially running experiments without calling them experiments. Change one thing, watch what happens. Try again. Make the fire hotter. Use a different material. Add something else. And remember the result. That sounds simple. But over hundreds or thousands of years, this kind of trial and error can become incredibly sophisticated. And glass was probably one of those discoveries. Now imagine a very hot fire. Not your fireplace. Not a campfire where you're roasting a marshmallow. We're talking about temperatures high enough to transform minerals. Because ordinary sand is mostly made of silica. And silica has an unusual property. When heated to extremely high temperatures, it can melt. But there's a problem. Pure silica requires an enormous amount of heat, far more than an ordinary ancient fire could easily provide. So early glassmaking had another secret. You don't necessarily need to melt pure silica. You can mix it with other materials that help lower the temperature needed for melting. And one of the most important ingredients is something that ancient people already had everywhere: ash. Certain plant ashes contain compounds that act as fluxes. In simple terms, they help the silica melt more easily. And suddenly, something that seemed impossible becomes much more achievable. Sand, ash, heat, and the right conditions. Those ingredients can produce something radically different, a glowing liquid. And when that liquid cools, it becomes glass. But here's the strange part. The first glass may not have been made deliberately. Humans had been making pottery long before glass. And pottery requires furnaces. Furnaces produce heat. People were already experimenting with minerals, pigments, glazes, and different mixtures. So eventually, someone was bound to discover that certain combinations of materials could melt into a glassy substance. Maybe it happened around a furnace, maybe inside a ceramic glaze, maybe through experimentation with colored minerals. We don't know the exact moment, and that's important. History often makes inventions look like they happened in one dramatic second. Someone has a brilliant idea, everyone applauds, and suddenly, civilization changes. Real invention is usually much messier. One person notices something strange. Someone else repeats it. Another person improves it. A craftsman discovers a better temperature. Another discovers a better mixture. Someone realizes the material can be shaped. Someone else figures out how to make it transparent. And eventually, something that started as an accident becomes a technology. The earliest known man-made glass appeared thousands of years ago in the ancient Near East and Egypt. And early glass wasn't necessarily the perfectly clear material you have in your house today. It could be colored, cloudy, full of bubbles, sometimes green, blue, yellow, or brown. And honestly, that makes sense, because ancient glassmakers weren't starting with purified industrial chemicals. They were working with natural materials full of impurities. Those impurities weren't just annoying. They could actually change the color of the final product. Copper could create blue or green colors. Iron could produce greenish or brownish tones. Other minerals could create completely different effects. So ancient glass wasn't just a material. It became a way to manipulate color. And that's where humans started doing something even more interesting. They stopped merely discovering glass and started designing it. At first, glass was valuable, very valuable, because making it required specialized knowledge. You needed the right ingredients, the right temperatures, the right equipment, and skilled craftsmen. So glass wasn't immediately something every household owned. Instead, it became associated with luxury, decoration, jewelry, and elite objects. Small glass beads, decorative pieces, amulets, containers, colored objects that could imitate precious stones. Think about how impressive that would have been. You could take ordinary-looking raw materials, heat them, shape them, and produce something that looked almost magical, something shiny, something colorful, something that could resemble gemstones. Glass gave ancient craftspeople a completely new visual language, but they still had a major problem. Making a solid lump of glass was one thing. Making something useful from it was another. Imagine holding a blob of molten glass. It's incredibly hot, it's sticky, it's dangerous, and if you let it cool in the wrong shape, you've got a useless chunk. So ancient craftspeople had to solve another problem. How do you control molten glass? And one of the most important breakthroughs was shaping it around a core. A craftsman could form glass around a temporary object, creating the basic shape of a container. This opened up a whole new world. Now, glass wasn't just decoration. It could become a vessel, something that could hold perfume, oils, cosmetics, precious liquids, and suddenly, this strange material had a practical purpose. But the biggest revolution was still coming, because eventually, humans figured out something that sounds almost ridiculous when you think about it. You can make glass into a tube, and then blow into it. Yes, blow into molten glass. This technique became known as glassblowing, and it completely changed the economics of glass. Instead of slowly building a container around a core, a skilled glassmaker could gather molten glass onto the end of a tube and inflate it, like blowing up a balloon. Except the balloon is glowing hot glass. With careful movements, the craftsman could rotate it, stretch it, shape it, and add more glass. Suddenly, glass objects could be produced much faster, and they could take an enormous variety of shapes. bottles, cups, jars, decorative objects. The material had gone from mysterious accident to sophisticated manufacturing technology, and this is one of the most fascinating patterns in human history. An invention becomes powerful when humans stop asking, "What is this?" and start asking, "What else can I do with it?" Glass had already been discovered. Now humans were exploring its possibilities. What if we make it thinner? What if we make it clearer? What if we add color? What if we shape it differently? What if we make it into a container? What if we make something flat? And eventually, what if we make it large enough to look through? That final question would change architecture, science, medicine, navigation, and eventually the entire modern world. But clear window glass didn't appear overnight. For a very long time, glass was still expensive and imperfect. Large sheets were difficult to produce. They could be uneven, wavy, colored, full of imperfections, and that meant windows were a luxury. Imagine living in a world where sunlight enters through a tiny opening, and having actual glass covering that opening is something only wealthy people can afford. That's how strange our modern world would look to an ancient person. And then something even more important happened. Humans started getting better at controlling the chemistry. They learned which ingredients produced clearer glass, which ingredients made it stronger, which temperatures worked best, which mixtures created particular colors. The process became less like magic and more like engineering. And eventually, glass stopped being a rare luxury and became infrastructure. Windows, bottles, mirrors, lenses, scientific instruments, and eventually, the screen you're probably watching this video on. Think about that for a second. The glowing rectangle in your hand is connected to an invention that began with humans heating minerals and discovering that they could turn into a strange solid. But glass didn't just give us windows. It changed what humans could see. Because once humans could manufacture clear glass, they could make lenses. And lenses are powerful. A curved piece of transparent material can bend light. That means you can make distant objects appear closer, tiny objects appear larger, and eventually, things invisible to the naked eye become visible. Telescopes let humans look farther into space. Microscopes let humans look deeper into life. Eyeglasses helped people see clearly. Optical instruments transformed science, all from controlling the way light moves through a material. And suddenly, glass wasn't simply something you looked through. It became something that changed what you were capable of seeing. Which brings us back to that ancient human standing beside a fire. They didn't know about silica. They didn't know about molecular structures. They didn't know that glass is an amorphous solid. They didn't have equations describing melting points. They didn't know they were beginning a technology that would eventually produce skyscraper windows, fiber optic cables, laboratory equipment, smartphone displays, and spacecraft instruments. They simply noticed something. Heat could change matter. And if you experiment enough, you can learn how to control that change. That's the real story of glass. Not that someone suddenly had a brilliant idea, but that humans kept paying attention. They noticed the strange thing. They tried it again. They changed the ingredients. They changed the heat. They changed the shape. They passed the knowledge forward. And eventually, something that once looked impossible became ordinary. So the next time you look through a window, don't just see a window. You're looking at thousands of years of accumulated human experimentation. The sand beneath someone's feet, the ashes left behind by a fire, the furnace of an ancient workshop, the hands of a craftsman, the discovery of a strange glowing liquid, and generations of people asking one simple question: what happens if we try this? That's how humans invented glass, not with modern science, not with a laboratory, but with curiosity, patience, and an almost ridiculous willingness to experiment with things that probably should have been left alone. And honestly, that's probably how most of civilization got invented. If you enjoyed discovering the strange origins behind something you use every single day, subscribe, because the modern world is full of ordinary objects with very unordinary stories.